Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Cleveland Clinic's CEO and President, Dr. Toby Cosgrove.
Well, good afternoon and welcome. We're delighted to have you here for the continuation of our series, Ideas for Tomorrow. Today, Tom Kelley is our speaker. Tom has been called the world's leading idea entrepreneur. He is an author, innovator, and a visionary. He helped develop the remarkable company called IDEO. He has been involved in the creation of hundreds of products, from Palm Pilots to portable defibrillators, for clients from Procter & Gamble to Sesame Street. The Guardian newspaper in London wrote that Tom Kelley throws off innovation the way lesser men throw off dandruff. Tom Kelley grew up in Barberton, Ohio. His father was an electrical engineer. Tom's brother David is the designer who founded IDEO in 1991. Tom was vice president of his class at Barberton High and a National Merit Scholar. He earned his BA from Oberlin and an MBA from the University of California at Berkeley. He was the top marketing student in his class at UC Berkeley. He was GE's top salesperson in the Western United States and a management consultant for Towers Perrin. He advised senior executives on organization and operational issues in North America, Asia, and Australia. Tom joined IDEO as director of marketing and led business development, personnel, and public relations. He helped his brother build IDEO from a 20-person shop to a global consultancy. Today, IDEO has 550 designers in offices on 3 continents. Tom Kelley is an international spokesman for IDEO's philosophy in books and personal appearances. His book in 2001, The Art of Innovation, has been translated into 11 languages. In 2005, the sequel, The 10 Faces of Innovation, identifies personas behind innovation and new ideas. Tom Peters called 10 Faces of Innovation a thoroughly original approach to creating a culture of innovation. Tom Kelley's articles have appeared in the Harvard Business Review and other journals. He's counseled companies around the world on how to create an innovative workplace, and recently told me he's now being asked to do this for countries. In 2009, the Kellogg School of Management gave him an award for the Distinguished Leadership. Tom Kelley and IDEO are having a powerful effect on the world and its systems. Here's an overview of IDEO and what it does.
Design is everywhere. In objects, systems, processes, in nature. Earth is a design planet, and we are the designer of our fate. IDEO is one of the world's most sought-after innovation and design firms, shaping products, processes, and experience for real-life users. Replacing everyday cognition with new vision, design thinking. By direct observation of the way people use the tools of daily life, IDEO studies them, analyzes them, asks how they can be made better, and transforms this data into successful products and systems. IDEO has worked on thousands of projects. Its clients and partners include the biggest names in business, information technology, manufacturing, fashion, pharmaceuticals. Innovation after innovation has followed. Now, the firm is upping the ante, increasingly designing for behavioral change, and is deeply committed to environmental and social issues. Government, business, and nonprofit clients have enlisted IDEO to help tackle childhood obesity, deliver clean water in the developing world, encourage blood donation, help consumers save money, and envision the future of video content delivery. New ideas from Design Think are happening every day. Holder of more than 1,000 patents, winner of more than 350 major design awards, consistently recognized as one of the world's most innovative companies. IDEO and its partners are reshaping our public and private worlds, making our planet a more beautiful and usable place to live.
Please join me in welcoming one of the most interesting and innovative people I know, Tom Kelley.
Okay, well, hi, good evening. Gee, what a great room. This was more than I was expecting. So, anyway, I'm Tom Kelley. I grew up not very far from here, and I'm here tonight to talk about this thing that my firm calls the 10 Faces of Innovation. It's about these 10 positive pro-innovation roles that you can play, or you as a leader can encourage others in your organization to play. But before I get into talking about those 10 faces, before I get into the specifics of that, I want to spend just a couple of minutes on innovation itself. And I know I shouldn't really have to do that, right? In practice, in principle, everybody's for it, right? Innovation, good thing, right? In fact, there was a recent CEO survey they sent out to the CEOs all over the world, and 85% of them, 85% of these CEOs said that innovation was on their strategic shortlist. And it wasn't even a multiple choice question, right? Responding to an open-ended question, they said, yeah, innovation is important to us. So in principle, everybody's for it. But in practice, there's a problem with innovation. In fact, there's a couple of problems with innovation. And here's one of them. One of the problems with innovation is it lives so squarely in what that guy, Dr. Stephen Covey, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People guy, it lives very squarely in what Covey would call quadrant 2. The important but not urgent stuff. And life is pretty urgent these days, right? There's a lot of stuff waiting for you when you show up for work in the morning. In fact, let's be honest, doesn't even wait anymore, right? It's right there on your bedside table when you wake up, right? And so in a very urgent world, it gets tempting to take something like innovation, to take something that lives in quadrant 2, and just put it off until tomorrow. Right, I'm going to do the urgent stuff today. I'll get to innovation tomorrow. But watch out, because if you do that, next thing you know, you're putting innovation off until tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. And you wake up one morning and notice that somebody else, some other organization, some other person, somebody elsewhere in the world who hasn't been putting innovation off until tomorrow is starting to take a piece of the world that you think should rightfully be yours. Right? And so that's why we believe, even if it lives in quadrant 2, innovation in the long run has an urgency all its own. Got to find time for innovation on a day-to-day basis. So that's problem number 1, right? Problem number 1 is that innovation lives there in the important but not urgent quadrant, right? Problem number 2 is this thing that at IDEO we call the Red Queen effect. And we called it before that new movie came out. If you've seen that new movie, very confusing. The Red Queen comes from the sequel to Alice in Wonderland. It's called Alice Through the Looking Glass. There's no Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland. Don't tell Helen Bonham Carter that. But anyhow, there's not supposed to be a Red Queen. There's the Queen of Hearts in that book, but never mind her. Those of you, hopefully many of you have read this book, right? I speak sometimes in places like, I just spoke in Japan, where they don't know this book and then the metaphor gets lost and whatever. But if you've read the book, or even if you haven't read the book, I'll tell you that the Alice Through the Looking Glass uses the metaphor of a chessboard throughout the whole book, right? And there's this moment in which Alice and this other character, the Red Queen, always in a bad mood. I'm not sure why, but always in a bad mood. And she and the Red Queen are trying to get across the chessboard. And their feet are moving, as you can see in the sketch. Their feet are moving, but it's almost like they're facing some sort of headwind or something, because although their feet are moving, they're not moving forward, right? And this is bugging the heck out of Alice. And Alice turns to the Red Queen and says, not in exactly these words, because it's a 150-year-old book, but basically Alice turns to the Red Queen and says, Red Queen, what's up with this? Our feet are moving, but we're not making our way across the chessboard. And the Red Queen impatiently, always in a bad mood, she impatiently turns to Alice and says, oh, Alice, you want to get somewhere else? You got to run twice as fast as that. And this is the bad news of innovation today. Not enough to be an innovator. You made an innovation last week and you're feeling so proud of yourself, not good enough. Got to make another innovation today, right? You got to keep ahead of the innovators all over the world, and some of those innovators are getting pretty darn good, right? And so that's the Red Queen effect. Got to keep up your pace of innovation. The only defense against the other innovators, the only defense against disruptors that are out there is to have your own pace of innovation stay ahead of theirs, if you want to get ahead or stay ahead in the modern world. I'll give you an example of this from the commercial world. These are two companies you're probably familiar with from an industry called consumer electronics, right? And the red line representing Sony, the blue line representing Samsung. And if you go back to the beginning of this chart, by the way, is a company called Interbrand, calculates the value of global brands, right? And all of you individually have a personal brand, and you work for companies that have a brand, or organizations or institutions, right? But Interbrand doesn't calculate all of our brands, but they do these, right? Every year for decades, they've been calculating the value of brands, and I'm only interested in these two for the purpose of this discussion, Sony and Samsung. And so you go back a decade ago, in the year 2000, here is Sony sitting on top of the world. I think it is safe to say that in the year 2000, Sony is the leading consumer electronics company in the world. And I don't know how to say, I speak some Japanese, I don't know how to say, boss, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But I'm sure some people at Sony were saying that in the year 2000. They were proud of their achievements, and rightfully so. But that pride led to some complacency. They got a chance to rest on their laurels for just a little bit, right? And as they did that, the value of the brand called Sony just started to taper down year by year just a little bit, headed south just a little bit, at exactly the moment that Samsung started to make its move. Chairman of Samsung came to the US and saw how his offerings, in this case his consumer electronics products, compared to the great global brands, and he said, uh-oh, we're going to work on this. And they did, right? And they did many of the things I'm going to talk about in a minute. They started doing anthropology. They set up what they called listening posts around the world to understand cultures, right? They started different experiments and trying things out. They started cross-pollinating from other places. And as a result of all those innovation efforts, the brand called Samsung started heading north. And year by year by year, Samsung started closing the gap until, as you can see in the chart, in the year 2005, it finally happened. What we were predicting was going to happen. We were working with Samsung in the early years of this chart, and we said this was going to happen, and it did in 2005. The value of the brand called Samsung passed the value of the brand called Sony for the first time in the history of enterprise. And if you look at the scale of that chart, it didn't just pass it passed it by $4 billion. Right? And Sony, waking up to that, Sony's been down, down, down year after year, wakes up to that and starts to do a turnaround, but Samsung has so much momentum they actually broaden the gap in the following year. So here's the thing. Here's why it's the Red Queen effect. Think about Sony. Just look at the red line itself for a minute. Think about Sony at any point in that graph. If you had to put them into one category, you could only choose digitally. It's in one category or another. Are they an innovator or are they not an innovator? Right? If you had to choose, what would you say? You'd say they're an innovator, right? They didn't stop innovating. They slowed their pace of innovation enough to let a hungry competitor pass them by, right? And you look at this graph, who do you even want to be? I want to be the hungry competitor, right? That's got a northward slope that is getting better year after year, rather than the top of the world, company, or top of the world organization that is a little too sure of itself, got a little too self-confident, resting on their laurels just a little bit, right? And in some ways, Sony's lucky to have Samsung, or Samsung's lucky to have Sony to go after, because they know who the target is. They know who they're competing against. I worked for a long time with PepsiCo, and wow, they know about Coke, right? You don't have to remind them. It's the blue line and the red line all over again, right? But for some people, and in some settings, it's not Sony versus Samsung. It's more like this. It's more like the dinosaurs. Unless we think badly of the dinosaurs, they ruled the Earth for 160 million years. Imagine 100 million years into being top of the food chain. Would you get a little overconfident, right? Would you get a little complacent? I think I would, right? And so notice that what did not happen to the dinosaurs, it was not some big competitor, right? They stayed at the top of the food chain all the way down, right? They didn't come along something bigger that ate them. What happened to the dinosaurs was they couldn't adapt as fast as the external environment was changing, right? And so here's the lesson from the dinosaurs. Got to wake up every day. You know, if you think about your career personally, if you think about your organization as it fits into the world, got to wake up every day and ask yourself, am I changing as fast as the world is changing? Because it's changing pretty darn fast right now. Am I changing as fast as the world changing? Because if I'm not, I am kind of, sort of, slowly turning into a dinosaur, right? So you got to think about your personal appetite for innovation, your personal pace of innovation, and this Red Queen effect. Because, wow, got to find a way to keep up. Got to find time every day for innovation, even if it lives in quadrant 2. So my firm, IDEO, has worked in over 4,000 innovation programs, new products, new services. As Toby described, we now work directly on corporate cultures. We work on social issues around the world. And as my brother David, the founder of our firm, says, you do something 4,000 times, either you're asleep at the wheel or you learn some things. And so when I set out to write my books, all I had to do was capture the lessons from those programs, from those innovation projects, right? I am not an anthropologist, although I'll talk about anthropology in a minute. I'm not an engineer. I am not a scientist, right? But I did get to be the lucky person at IDEO who became the chronicler, who tried to capture those lessons. And so I interviewed every person in the firm and many of our clients and tried to figure out what worked and what didn't work. What were the key success factors for innovation? And so I've distilled those down into this, my current book is called The 10 Faces of Innovation, because innovation itself is a little big to work on, right? But you can break it down into its component parts. And for purposes of discussion, I broke it down into 10 parts. And then the book came out, and then about 15 minutes later, I learned something. I was reminded something I already kind of sort of knew, which is that the human brain, there's really good academic research that proves, basically, the human brain has a 7-bit processor, which is to say you can deal with 7 things at a time. You can remember a 7-digit number. You can remember a list with 7 items. You can look at objects on a table and say, sure, 7. Right? But as soon as it gets to 8, your brain has to say, let me see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Right? You have to count because your brain can't swallow 8 bits of data all at once. But it can, on average, can do 7. By the way, the academic research some of you may have seen from a long time ago is called the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. Right? Which means with certain smart people, I'm sure we got some of them in the room, right? Certain smart people can actually process 9 bits at a time. Certain, let's call them challenged people, 5 bits at a time, but the average person on the street, 7, right? But keep in mind, go back to the math for a minute, 7 plus or minus 2, even at plus 2, you don't get to 10, right? So if you ever write a book, and I recommend a book, they're fun. After they're done, they're fun. But if you ever write your book, please learn from my mistake. Never make your book about 10, too many, right? Stop at 7. Remember Stephen Covey? Smarter than he looks, right? 7 habits of highly effective people, right? He got it right, I got it wrong. Please don't make that mistake. So not going to talk about the 10. I'm going to talk about probably 3 of the 10 faces of innovation. But just so you don't feel cheated, I am going to give you a kind of a glancing look at the other 7. And I learned this, another lesson that I'll share with you, in case you can learn from it, which is I gave a talk in China a while back. And the title of the talk, just like tonight, the title was called 10 Faces of Innovation, right? And then, like I did tonight, I talked about 3 of them, right? And sometimes when you're working across culture, it's hard to interpret humor, right? Were they kidding? Was that facetious? Irony doesn't play well. In case you're traveling overseas, don't try it. People misinterpret all the time, right? And so I hope they were kidding, but I do know that at dinner, they mentioned the topic that I'd promised them to talk about 10 faces of innovation. I'd only talked about 3. Should they be asking for 70% of their money back, right? So just so you don't feel cheated, I'm going to talk about the 10 very briefly, and then I'm going to dive down deeper on the 3. So 10 topics, 10 roles, 10 leadership roles. The first one, I'll come back to these. These are the learning roles. I think they're the most important. So I'll gloss over them right now, but we're coming back to all 3 of these, the anthropologist, the experimenter, the cross-pollinator. But let me go on for now to the organizing roles. because these are ones that at IDEO we pretty much ignored for the first, I would say, 15 years of the firm. We thought that, life should be a meritocracy. All good ideas should float to the top and get implemented. All bad ideas should sink to the bottom and be ignored. We thought that for a while, and now we think, how naive were we, right? There is a messy process. Inside of an organization, out in the public world, there is a messy process by which ideas get kind of sponsored or pushed forward or supported, and others get set aside. And it's not all a meritocracy, it's a very messy process. So the organizing roles acknowledge that, and they say, look, let's at least try to understand this process so we can play to win. Try to understand this game. And my favorite of the organizing roles is the hurdler. If you watch the Olympics, the Summer Olympics, I love the hurdler. You notice them? They go around the track. They don't even slow down. That thing is pretty high. You ever been out on the track and looked at those hurdles? They're hard to get over, right? They don't even slow down. In fact, as I mentioned in my book, take the hurdles away. They don't run any faster, right? These hurdlers, they are not the fastest humans on Earth. They're the fastest hurdlers. Right? They have optimized, they have trained for the hurdles. They could run those hurdles blindfolded, right? They're counting their steps between the hurdles, right? And you want a lot of hurdlers on your team. You want the kind of person on your team who says, of course there will be obstacles on the road to innovation. I love an obstacle, right? Because I'm a hurdler, an obstacle is my chance to show my stuff. An obstacle is my chance to make my biggest contribution to the team, right? So you want lots of those people on your team, hurdlers. There's the collaborator who's always trying to bring in different points of view and invite more people to the party, so that when you come to market, when your idea reaches when it's ripe and ready to be harvested, that it's included enough points of view. There's the director. We're talking about a certain kind of director. At IDEO, when we talk about this, we're not talking about the autocrat necessarily. We're talking about the kind of director that you see in Hollywood or on stage productions. You notice in the Hollywood movies, and some of you probably watch the Oscars, the directors never take the stage, right? They do at the Oscars, and they're happy to do so, right? But on the film itself, the directors, with the notable exception of Alfred Hitchcock, the directors never appear on screen. They see it as their job to find the most talented, most creative people that they can and make them into stars, right? I had the chance recently to meet Francis Ford Coppola, and he said, when you're working with really bright, creative people, he says, you don't tell them what to do. He said, you invite them to the party. And I've tried to keep that idea fresh in my mind, to invite them to the party. And so that's the kind of director we mean. So those are the organizing roles. Here's the building roles. There's one called the experience architect. And I think there are some architects in the audience. And I mean this with a small a. I mean designing great customer experiences, right? Not that they don't focus just on the nouns, on the narrow definition of what they're offering is. They look at the whole experience that people have around it. And so that we would call that designing an experience. There's the set designer who uses the physical environment as a way to influence the attitude, behavior, even the performance of the team. There are certain spaces that just bring out the best in you, and there are certain spaces that make you feel like a cog in the wheels of industry, right? And the set designer understands that and uses that as a way to enhance the performance, to make the team feel differently or perform better by using the physical environment. There's the caregiver, and I mean this in a metaphorical sense. I mean companies, organizations, people who use that metaphor of a great doctor or nurse. When you're having that one-on-one experience with a great doctor or nurse, you feel nurtured, you feel taken care of, right? And so great organizations understand that kind of nurturing relationship and try to build it with people around them. And last but not least is the storyteller, another one we completely ignored. We thought that data should speak for itself. And now we realize data is not very powerful, right? Data, if I give you a number, even if it's got less than 7 digits, you start to forget it right away, right? But think about stories. You're carrying around in your head and in your heart these stories from early childhood, right? So if you've got something important to say, whether it's to your internal group or whether it's you're trying to say to the world, put it in the form of a story. That story will carry your message with it. And the storyteller, acknowledging that, tries to when they've got data, they wrap their data in a story. So that's 10. See what I mean? Too many? Anybody remember number 4? Right? I'm not sure I do. So, not going to talk about the 10. I'm going to circle back. I'm going to talk about 3. And the first of the 3, the most important one for sure, as far as I'm concerned, is called the anthropologist. Because, the reason I like this one so much, I have the faith of a convert on this one. I didn't get it on anthropology. I wish I could say I did. I love those CEO memoirs where they're always the first. I was the first to see the power of the internet. I was first to understand, the value of social networking, those kind of things. I was the last, right? We had this business, when I joined it was called David Kelley Design, founded by my brother David. And we were doing stuff, we had all engineers. 100% of the professionals were engineers when I joined. And they were doing stuff like designing laptop computers made out of cast magnesium that you could drop 4 feet onto concrete. And they were trying to make it so they wouldn't break. And this was clearly hard. Right? There was no mistaking it as something that I could possibly do, right? Just like, okay, good luck with that, guys, whatever. And so we're doing this intensely technical, intensely challenging, specification-driven work, and it was also, by the way, very clear what success and failure looked like. You'd look at the parts of the computer there on the concrete, and you'd say, well, Joe, back to the drawing board. Right? And we had drawing boards back then, a long time ago. Anyhow, so the engineers are doing this stuff that clearly was very, very difficult. And along come these anthropologists. And the anthropologists, they all joined us at once in 1991. And the anthropologists, they would do stuff like sit by lakes and streams and watch kids fish and then come back and tell us about it. And I said to my brother at the time, now here's a job, right? I think I could do this. I mean, they seem to have PhDs in, cognitive psychology or anthropology or ethnography or something like that, but is this hard? Because I could watch the kids, right? I could take the pictures. I could come back and tell us about it. This doesn't seem hard. In fact, I'm not sure if this will translate, but you might appreciate it. Me coming from small-town Ohio, and our business is based in the Silicon Valley. And I said to my brother at the time about this anthropology stuff, I said, David, this stuff is kind of California, don't you think? By which I meant of questionable value. The kind of stuff you'd talk about in a hot tub or something, right? I didn't get it. I dragged my feet. I was skeptical. It seemed soft and fluffy and of questionable value in 1991, right? But here we are, 2010. I've come 180 degrees. I was won over by the anthropologist to believe that this is the single most important source of innovation at IDEO. And we got a lot of innovation going on, right? Because we still have those great technical minds, right? We still have those great innovation problem solvers, but gotta know what problem to solve, right? And these anthropologists are hilariously good at going out in the field and seeing something and saying, hey, look at that. By the way, if you're ever with an anthropologist and they say, hey, look at that, or if they say, hey, what just happened there? Both cases, let your ears perk up because they're about to tell you something, right? And so the anthropologists go out in the field and they discover a new problem, or they discover one that nobody's paid enough attention to before, that really takes the form of a latent human need. And when the anthropologist sees people with a need and you go out and solve it, they will thank you for it, right? It's something people always needed, even if they didn't know it. And we think humans are not especially good at raising their hand and saying, hey, you know what I need that doesn't exist in the world yet? Right? People just don't think that way. They say, you got this one. Can I have it a little cheaper next year? Can I have it a little smaller? Can I have it with an iPhone dock on it? Right? They know the little incremental things, but the big changes, people just don't think about. And so the anthropologist can find the opportunities by doing the observation. I'll give you some examples in a minute. So when I started my first book, I thought I would use as the structure for the book our methodology for innovation. We have this methodology which has proven useful to us to add structure to an unstructured problem. Most of the things we work on these days are unstructured problems. And so if the question is, how do you get better access to clean water in Africa, or how do you address issues of unwanted pregnancies among teens, right? Those are both complex problems, right? It's very hard to sit down at your desk and start drawing things that are the solution to those. And so we have this methodology, and I thought this would be my structure, right? And I won't describe it in detail, but basically we try to understand the current situation first. And then we observe, that's the anthropology part. Then we interpret what we just saw, and then, and only then, we start through this cycle of expression, we call it, where we visualize, prototype, evaluate, refine. And you might go around that cycle a lot of times. In fact, I'll talk about somebody went through that cycle more than 5,000 times in a minute, until you find something, the right one to implement. So I thought, oh, here's my structure. But in the end, I threw this structure away because I figured out this is not where the magic is at IDEO. This is kind of step one, step two. It's useful to us, but I threw out methodology, and instead I talked about work practices. We do things with a minimum of hierarchy. We do things with lots of brainstorming. We do things lots of prototyping. So I threw this away except for that second step, except for observe, because as I said, this is the single biggest source of innovation at IDEO. And by the way, on this slide, the image is an IDEO guy named Christian Simsarian, who went into the emergency department of a local hospital with a video camera just basically stuck on his head. And it's a testimony to the weirdness that docs and nurses and healthcare professionals in the emergency department have to deal with it. Nobody ever said to him, hey, buddy, what's that video camera glued to your head for? Right? It's just, that's nothing compared to the weirdo I got over here, right? And so he went all the way through that process. Lots of pictures of the tiles on the ceiling, but we did observations. We learned from that process, and it was really eye-opening even to people who worked in that room, that we showed them things that they hadn't really noticed before. And so anyhow, that's a bit of anthropology in the field. So the historical perspective in this anthropology stuff comes from Marcel Proust, that French essayist who said, the real act of discovery consists not in finding new lands, but in seeing with new eyes. And this is what the anthropologist helps you to do, but this is kind of hard, right? Because as you go through your career, as you develop more and more and more expertise in your field, that expertise is extremely valuable to the organization you work in. But as part and parcel of developing that expertise, you start to screen things out. They're, quote, distractions. They're anomalies, right? No, we don't pay attention to that when that happens, right? Whereas sometimes those distractions are opportunities, right? And if you can see with fresh eyes, you can discover things that might be needed in the world. We believe in this point of view so much, we've actually developed some language around it. There's a dictionary word that I'm sure you've all heard of. You've probably all said it, déjà vu. It's used in all languages of the world that I have seen. It's one of those things that doesn't get translated directly into French, meaning been there before. Right? But we use a term not in the dictionary. It came originally, I think, from George Carlin, but then picked up by a friend of mine at Stanford University named Bob Sutton, and has landed very squarely at IDEO now, and it's not in the dictionary, and it's the opposite of déjà vu, and we call it vujade. Right, so vujade is when you've been in a place 1,000,000 times before, but you see it with fresh eyes. You say, hey, look at that. Why does everybody in the world do it that way? Why do we make them fill that form out twice? Why is the world this way? Right? And if you can see things with fresh eyes, if you can get this experience of vujade, which the anthropologist will help you to do, wow, you can see opportunities hidden in plain sight. And I'll give you some examples in a minute. So there's a woman at Harvard University, Dorothy Leonard is a professor there, and she talks about sparking innovation through empathic design with empathy. That's what she calls this anthropology-fueled design process. And she says, of course, all organizations have some way of learning about their constituents, learning about the people around them. She says, you take a car company and they'll bring people into one of those little white rooms, right, with the two-way mirrors there so the marketing team can sit on the other side and drink coffee and make fun of the customers, right? And you can ask their customers questions, and as long as the questions are easy, the customers can help you. You're a car company, you could put your customers in there and say, hey, next car you buy, would you like to have cloth car seats or leather car seats? Everybody can answer that question. Some people will say, I like a leather car seat. So you write that down. This customer likes leather, right? And then you say, hey, would you pay $5 more for that? And anybody who said they like the leather one probably will give you $5 more for it. Then you say, would you pay $5,000 more? And everybody who doesn't drive a Maserati will say no to that one. And so you can narrow in on what do they like and what's it worth to them, right? And you got all that data that you can take back home and crunch back in the marketing department, right? But Dorothy Leonard says, yeah, fine, that works only because those customers you brought in that little white room, everybody's been in a car, everybody's been in a car seat, chances are everybody's been in a cloth one and a leather one, so this is like shopping. She says people are really good at shopping, but try asking them about the future. Try asking them about something that doesn't yet exist in the world and then see what happens. And people do attempt to do this. She says it doesn't usually work. She says, while you got those car customers in the room, ask them another question. Ask them a question like, say, what doesn't the front door of your house currently do that you would like it to do? Well, first, they don't understand the question, right? But if they do understand the question, my front door, I mean, it just opens and closes, it locks when I want it to, you're like, I got no idea, right? And so Dorothy says, don't ask them. Follow those people home. She says, you follow 100 people home to 100 houses, you'll see opportunities. Not all of them worth implementing, right? Some that are not profitable, some that are too much of a niche market, some that don't make sense, but you will see opportunities and probably some of them will be actionable. Maybe a better example from Dorothy is she says, in 1999, right before that Sony Samsung graph I showed you started, if you were Sony or Samsung or any consumer electronic company in the world, you could bring your customer into that little white room and you could say, hey, you got a video cassette recorder, and we make video cassette recorders, but we need a new one, right? Because in that industry, as some of you may know, you want to hold your head up in the consumer electronics world. You got to have something new for the Consumer Electronics Show, right? First week of January, Las Vegas, Nevada, got to have at least a new feature, if not a new product, right? So you ask all your people, hey, what do you need that you don't have in your VCR? They have no idea, right? Yeah, they're scratching their head. Eventually, you ask enough people, and somebody will raise their hand in 1999 and say, hey, I got it. I want super fast rewind. Because when I am done watching that videotape, I want to just, I hate to sit there and watch those numbers rewind back to zero, right? It takes minutes, and I hate to just sit there and watch it. I want to take it straight back to Blockbuster. Give me super fast rewind, right? So the coffee drinkers on the other side of the mirror are saying, buddy, get a life, would you? Just go to the refrigerator and get a beer or something. You don't have to watch the numbers go back to zero. But never mind, that's just your judgment. Your customer has just told you what's important to them. And so if you're paying attention, you write it down. Customers want super fast rewind, right? And so you go back to the technical team and you say, hey, this just in from the field. Our customers want super fast rewind. Can you do that? What are they going to say? Yeah, you know that team, right? Yeah, that's kind of an interesting problem. I could put a big flywheel on. I could put a third motor on. Yeah, I think I can work on that. And so if you got the right team, and I know many of you have the right team in your organizations, right? But if you got the right team and you're Sony in the year 1999, you make it on budget, you make it on schedule. There you are in the Consumer Electronics Show, Las Vegas, Nevada, manning your little trade show booth, right? And you are so proud of yourself because here you are in your trade booth with your newest suit on, right? And you're there, and behind you it says, world's fastest rewinding VCR, right? And so you've made it, right? You've mission accomplished, as they say. And you're feeling really good until you look over at the booth next door, and they got DVD players, right? Better audio, better video, renders the idea of rewinding obsolete. But Dorothy Leonard from Harvard, Dorothy says, why'd you miss that? She says, I'll tell you why you missed it. She says, because no customer in the history of the world has ever said, hey, you know what I want to do? I want to throw away these videotapes I've been collecting for the last 25 years and start over with little silver discs. They just, they don't think that way. Dorothy says, you want to go for breakthrough innovations. You want to have the big change. She says you can't ask them. You got to observe. She says you look at what humans need, and then you look at what capabilities your organizations have, and you look for the intersection in the future. She says that's the way you do the big innovations. She says your customers, unfortunately, will not help you through, not by asking them, but if you observe, you will find opportunities. So here's the good news on this anthropology stuff. Yes, if you have the 7 years and want to get the PhD in anthropology, I recommend it. I love the anthropologist IDEO, and they are smarter than me, no doubt. But good news is you can do this. In fact, having had 0 courses in anthropology in my lifetime, not only do I find it easy to switch into anthropologist mode, I find it hard to switch out. I'm in anthropologist mode all the time. right? I took one of those little planes in from Chicago last night, and on the little plane where you gate check the bag, and then you're now in the little jetway, and there's like 50 people lined up on both sides, and the line extends 100 yards into the jetway, and a guy with one bag sets it down, and all 100 of us are supposed to lean out far enough to see whether that's your bag, and all the bags are black anyhow, so you can't tell. I was thinking, let's see, mirror, camera, something's got to give there. They could work on that. But anyhow, sorry, off the subject. So I'm in anthropologist mode all the time, and so here's an example, also related to travel. Why is that? I don't know. Here's an example of anthropology where I was at the Paris airport. Anybody ever been to that airport in Paris, Charles de Gaulle? Anybody like it? I don't. Anyhow, it's awful. I hate the Paris airport. Turns out, I just found out last year, it's actually 2 airports. The one I hate with the little tiny circle where you're always lost and you go around 3 times, that's actually called Terminal 1. Right? But next door, there's this thing called Terminal 2 with beautiful architecture and lots of air and light and great cafes and stuff like that. And I think that one's just for French people. Right? Anyhow, but regardless, you come in Terminal 2, Terminal 1, whichever one you want to get into Paris, by far the best way is called the RER train. It's faster than a taxi, it's great, it's cheap, it's fast, it's safe, it's all good. The RER train, I think, costs about €7. The only thing is, you want to get into Paris on that RER train, you get to the train station, it's right there in the middle of the airport, which is great, but you want to get in, you got to get through that turnstile. And this is not easy, right? If you've seen these turnstiles, right, you got to front up between them. Basically what you got to do, you put your little purple ticket in, but then at exactly the moment you want to walk through, what you have to do is hold your 2 carry-on bags at chest height, and then with your third hand, reach down and pull that purple ticket at exactly the moment that you step through the turnstile, right? So I eventually make it through. I can't even remember how. But now I got Paris, just the other side of that train, there's Paris calling. But no way, I'm not going to Paris yet. I got to switch into anthropologist mode and see, how do people do this, right? It was really hard for me. How do others do it? Right, and I'm sitting there in anthropologist mode for 15 minutes, and I see triple digits. I saw more than 100 people navigate this turnstile, and I'm here to report 0. 0 people with 2 or more bags made it through this turnstile easily the first try. I saw strategies. I saw different gambits. I saw the most popular one was not being used by this couple, the 2-person method, as in, honey, you go through first and I'll pass you the bags. I saw solo travelers, no kidding, toss one of their bags across. That's that 4 feet on the concrete test for your laptop I was talking about earlier, right? But I saw 0 people just sail through it, right? So here's the thing, it's kind of bourgeois in a sense, if it actually occurred to anybody in the train station. I'm there, 15 minutes, I see 100 people struggle. There's people been working in that train station for a decade. They never even noticed. Right? And it's not just because they're French people, right? It's because you stop seeing things. Paul Sappho down the street from me at the Institute for the Future, he says, I don't know who it was that discovered water, but I'm sure it was not a fish, right? You get immersed in your environment, and the atmosphere becomes the wallpaper. You stop seeing things, and if you can get this bourgeois experience, if you can learn from the anthropologist, you can see opportunities. I'll show you an example of this. Opportunities hidden in plain sight. So here's one, just as an example. Very simple one, but I like it because it explains the process and the potential of anthropology. So this is more than a decade ago. We get approached by OralB, big maker of toothbrushes, and OralB says to us, yeah, our toothbrushes are doing fine, but our kids' toothbrush is starting to be commoditized. And this is really bad. Right? You never want, whatever it is that you do in the world, you don't want what you're doing to be a commodity. Right? In the product world like this, as soon as you're a commodity, you're competing against China every day, and it is darned hard to win in that game. Because as soon as you're a commodity, everything is about price. You got to be special. Right? Got to find some way to be special. And so OralB comes to us, and they admit to us, very frankly, that they're not as special as they'd like to be. They said, can you help us with that? So we said, sure. We're going to start with anthropology. And they said, really? Anthropology? It's not rocket science, right? Just sit down, start designing stuff, start drawing stuff, right? We said, no, this is how we do it. And they said, okay, if you must, right? And so we take them with us, and they are skeptical, and they are perfectly right to be skeptical. Remember, I was skeptical, but we go out with them. By the way, when you're doing this anthropology, sometimes you have to be really careful about how many people you take out, right? Because as soon as you get the enthusiasm for anthropology, then everyone wants to go. And just ask yourself, how many people can you get in the bathroom with that 6-year-old boy when he's brushing his teeth, right? So we try to limit it to 3. So that day, it was one of our anthropologists, it was one of our designers, and it was one of the client team members. And we're out there, and luckily, because we've got this skeptical client there, luckily, we make a discovery the first day. We're out there, and we're watching little kids brush their teeth, and we notice, in day 1, the anthropologists notice, that every kid's toothbrush in the history of the world has had the same implicit assumption. It's quite a logical assumption. It just, well, anyhow, I'll tell you, which is the assumption was parents have big hands, right? Kids have little hands, with me so far, right? Right? So therefore, kids' toothbrushes should be like their parents, but smaller and skinnier, right? Perfectly logical. Until you do the anthropology, until on the first day of observations, the anthropologist says, hey, look at that. Remember I said when the anthropologist says that, you got to pay close attention. Hey, look at that. Kids don't hold a toothbrush the way their parents do, right? You all hold the toothbrush in your fingertips because this is where your fine motor control is. This is where all your dexterity is, right? Kids don't do that. Kids fist it. Kids hold it like this. Right? In fact, we notice some kids, they'll hold the toothbrush too high on the brush, and they'll actually literally punch themselves in the face when they're brushing. And we try to address that issue, too, in the new design. But mainly, we were looking at this thing. We said, kids don't need a skinny one. They need a big, fat toothbrush. Let's make it a big, fat, squishy toothbrush while we're at it. And you may have noticed now everybody in the world makes those big, fat, squishy toothbrushes because all innovations get copied eventually. But our client reports, I saw her in a coffee shop 3 years later, our client reports that after we discovered that little thing about the way kids hold a toothbrush, they had the best-selling kids' toothbrush in the world for the next 18 months. Right? And imagine you were skeptical about anthropology, and then you went out and did a little bit of it, and you were suddenly best in the world in your category for 18 months. Would that be worth it? Right, I think that would be worth it, right? And so far from being soft and squishy, I think that the anthropology stuff goes straight at the heart of the matter, right? That it is important to the process of innovation. So, here's one of the great benefits in the healthcare world is when you combine this observation with experience, it starts turning into intuition. There's a great book by a guy named Gary Klein called Intuition at Work, in which his first story in the book is about 2 nurses. Both experienced nurses, they're working in the neonatal ICU. But one has had a lot of experience, has worked her whole career with babies, and has been in the neonatal ICU for 6 years. And the other one, although she's experienced, she's new on the ward. And so the newer nurse is responsible for this little baby who she notices some symptoms. You know, the baby seems to have been doing a little better and was gaining some weight and things like that. But on her shift, on the night shift, she noticed that the baby was a little lethargic at feeding time. But, you know, babies sleep a lot, and so she didn't think much of that. And the baby got a little heel stick, and it continued to bleed for a little while, but that also is not so uncommon depending on the skill and precision of the person doing the heel stick. And she noticed her temperature was a little off, but it was a little low. It was not high. And so she wasn't very worried. And so, you know, she's responsible for this baby, and she's a competent nurse, and she's doing a good job. But when the other nurse comes by, she takes one look at the baby and says, "That baby looks funny to me." I think that's the technical medical term for it. That baby looks funny to me. What she saw that the other nurse didn't see is the complexion of the baby. It was a little bit mottled. There was something a little funny about it. And then so she looks at the temperature chart, and she looks at the other data available to her, and she feels the baby's stomach and sees it's a little bloated. And she runs to the phone and calls the doctor on duty and says, "Doc, I think we got a baby in trouble here." And what she suspected, and some of the medical professionals in the room may know, is sepsis, which, as you may know, it takes 24 hours to be sure. You do the blood test, and it's 24 hours later, but you got to start the antibiotics before that. And so she saved the baby's life that day. She was right. Right? But it took her intuition. The individual symptoms did not point to the answer. It was the constellation of symptoms, and that mapped against her years and years of observation. that had blended into intuition, the combination of those things that allowed her to save the baby's life that day. And so that's one of the real payoffs of observing carefully, is it informs your intuition. So look, that was my favorite one. As I said, I promise to be quicker about the others. That was anthropology. Let's move on quickly to the experimenter. And this is about being willing to take some risks, and taking risks behind the scenes in a safe way, but being willing to say, this experiment didn't work in the way we hoped, and we're going to try another one. Right? But to do that, to have small failures behind the scenes so you can have a success when you're ready to release something to the world. And the quintessential experimenter in history for the US is Thomas Edison, who he didn't like that word failure, but he did say at one point in his career, I haven't failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that do not work. Right, he was coming up with the material for an electric light bulb, the filament. And tungsten doesn't just pop into your brain. It took him 10,000 tries to get that. Right, but he did okay, right? His light bulbs are now on the way out, but he had a 100-year run, right? And he left us General Electric as well. So not bad, Thomas Edison, even in spite of all those failures. We remember him as a success. And then here's two more modern-day examples. WD-40, anybody have any WD-40 at their house, right? Anybody not? I mean, it's practically ubiquitous. Ever think about the name? I hadn't. A name only an engineer could love. It's a spray oil, so of course it does water displacement, right? WD, right? But the 40 is more interesting to me. The 40 is because the first 39 formulas failed. Imagine going to your boss after the 38th failure and saying, well, we're going to stick with this just a little longer. Right? But as you may have seen in the newspaper, it is just past its 50th year. They have not changed that formula in 50 years, which is darn rare in the world of consumer products. They change the graphics about once every decade or two, but they had that 39 failures before they came up with WD-40. And then in the failure, innovator, experimenter Hall of Fame is this guy, James Dyson. Anybody have one of his cyclonic vacuums? A lot of people. Anyhow, he reports that he had 5,128 failures before he had one he could sell. And wow, 5,128 prototypes. I got to ask Jim if I ever see him, a couple of questions. Question number one is, Jim, why'd you keep track? Because when my failures got into quadruple digits, I would just say lots. I had lots of failures than a big success, right? But then the other thing is, I got a better question for Jim Dyson. Jim, were you married at the time? Right? Because that is one patient spouse. But so the idea is they weren't failing randomly. They had learning attached. In the history of IDEO, I think the ugliest prototype ever made was this one. It's actually for a surgical tool called the Gyros Diego. And a guy in one of our meetings was frustrated at the progress of the conversation, and he left the meeting for 5 minutes. And he came back with this ugly little prototype. If you were a cost accountant trying to assign the cost of that, you'd have to say 0. This prototype cost us 0. It's a whiteboard marker. That antique black thing in the middle, that's a Kodak film canister. And then there's a orange clothespin, and it's all taped together with Scotch tape. And when they handed it to the person beside him and said, hey, are you thinking of something like this? The person did not laugh at him. The person held it in their hand and said, yeah, something a little bit like this. Right? And so we went forward to this very precise surgical tool, starting with this ugly prototype. I don't want you to think that was the only prototype. There were 30 more. But still, the lesson I learned from the Gyros Diego is, got to find a way to lower the bar. And I don't mean when you reach the market. I mean at the embryonic stage. If you can lower the bar so that anyone in the organization feels comfortable floating an idea, trying a prototype, you can get more ideas into the organization. And so that's the lesson of the experimenter. Let me skip on to the cross-pollinator, the cross-pollinator is half student, half teacher. Right? Student means they're reading all the time, they're consuming, they travel a lot, they're always in learning mode. But some people, having just learned something, they hold it really tight because they think knowledge is power. They don't want to let any out. But the cross-pollinator is almost an unstable element until they've shared it with 2 or 3 or 4 people, right? And so you want lots of cross-pollinators, people who are part student and part teacher in your organization. Because some ideas do start in the US and get cross-pollinated elsewhere, but there are other opportunities out there, right? And so some of you may know of the Aravind Eye Hospital in India that's done these thousands and thousands of cardiac surgeries at a average cost of $20 per surgery, and a very, very high success rate. And of course, much of what they do could not be used in the US, but I gotta believe there's some opportunities that something about their production model might be usable, that you could cross-pollinate it here to the US. We had a doc who spent time with a NASCAR pit crew. And we thought, what'd you learn from the NASCAR pit crew? But he gave us examples of things he learned from that super high, fast-paced precision world of a pit crew. If you watch them, they're quite amazing. And I thought, well, there's a weird story I never heard before, until then I read a few months later in the Wall Street Journal a different doc, a different hospital, the London's Great Ormond Street Hospital, where he was watching a Ferrari pit crew. And he said, this is it's like ballet. It's done with such precision. He said, compared to our handoff after surgery, he says, we could learn some things from them. And they did. They literally brought in the Ferrari pit crew. And what he reported, was printed in the Wall Street Journal, he said it reduced technical errors by 42% and information errors by 49%. They cross-pollinate. These people with these great educations, these docs, learned from guys with grease on their fingernails. So it is possible to cross-pollinate. And I'll just leave you with one idea, not about cross-pollinating across countries or cultures or industries, but across generations, which is that if you, like me, if put a few years under your belt, hopefully some of you have mentors, people older than you that you've learned some things from, but there's this other opportunity, and it's called a reverse mentor. Because trust me, there are things in the world that there are trends that do not start with balding 50-year-old white males. I wish that were not the case, but trust me, it is, right? And so if you've got a lot of experience, you can completely benefit from finding somebody who's probably younger than you that'll keep you alert, keep you aware of new things happening in the world. And I don't just mean pop culture. I have 2 teens in the house, so I get all the pop culture. I mean things that are new in the world that you need to know about. A.G. Lafley, head of Procter & Gamble, brought his senior management team, 40 people, into the room a few years back, and he said, okay, be honest, who really understands biotechnology? 40 people in the room, no hands go in the air. And he said, uh-oh, I think that's a problem. He says, I think biotech might be essential to the future of our company. And we just admitted the senior management team doesn't know enough about it because it wasn't taught when we were in school. So he says, I want everybody in the room to go out in the next 5 days and get a reverse mentor in biotechnology. And they did, including the CEO. And so they came up to speed by learning from people younger than them. We bring a lot of young interns into IDEO every summer. My brother calls it the eggs teaching the chickens, right? You got to find ways to learn that is beyond just your circle of experience and friends. So look, you have very complex lives, and I don't pretend to understand the nuances of your workplace. But I do believe if you can take these 3 ideas to heart, if you can be the anthropologist and get out in the field and do observation of how people actually behave, where their latent needs are, if you can be the experimenter and be willing to try things and create an idea-friendly environment around you in which things are allowed to be tried, right? With all the safety guidelines in place, of course. And if you can be a cross-pollinator and look across industries, look across culture, look across generations for learning opportunities, you do those things well, it'll go a long way towards helping you build and nurture and reinforce your own unique cultures of innovation. Thank you very much. There. Okay, so I think I've left a couple of minutes for questions. If anybody's got one, and there's somebody right there with a question. That was almost magical. Yes, how'd you do that? Okay, go ahead.
What can leadership do to motivate a organization and a department to be more creative and innovative?
So there's lots of things leaders can do. I'll just pick a single one, which relates to the experimenter one. When we're working with very senior leaders, a skill that we try to teach them is one we call squinting. Right? You think about that super ugly prototype that I showed, right? It would be very easy for a leader to kick that person out of their office. Like, what's this ugly thing? Right? And if you do that, word gets out that it's got to be polished, it's got to be perfect before it gets to the boss, right? And you as the leader, you get to see fewer ideas that way, right? But if you can squint, right, if you can ignore all the surface details of an idea and just look at the shape of the idea and say, gee, you might have something there, take it just one more step before we decide to commit to this. Right? If you can develop that squinting skill, we think you'll see more ideas, and if you see more ideas, you'll end up having better ideas. So that's just one of the leadership traits people can have. Is somebody at a microphone? Okay.
Yeah, fantastic presentation.
Oh, thank you.
What do you do inside your company to get your technical people to kind of get creative, think out of the box, and think of new solutions for things that they wouldn't typically do?
Sure. Well, this is a big question. I think I've written 2 books on that topic. But there's a few things. One is somehow find some way to tap into the entire brain of the organization. Right? In the old days, I mentioned Procter & Gamble, who's a company I greatly admire. I watched them turn from a stable but slightly stodgy company into this great innovator. Right? And one of the things that they did was they got people to bat ideas around a lot more. And so one thing that we do is a culture of brainstorming, right? In which on a routine basis, whenever you confront a complex problem, you call a brainstorming session. In some cultures, that's an admission of weakness. It's like, Tom, this is your problem. Why are you asking for me for help on it? Right? But in the right kind of culture, you don't want to spin your wheels on a problem that you are stuck on, because the 3 people who sit next to you, they might have the answer like that. Right? And so if you can get the culture going, that it's the expected thing as opposed to it's an admission of weakness, then we think you can tap into the whole brain of the culture. And in the old days, Procter & Gamble would specify this thing: we just want you to co-dispense 2 liquids of a certain viscosity. And they're getting this much of our brain. Right? But now they say, what's the future of blank? And they're tapping into the whole brain of the company. And so kind of reframing the problem sometimes helps people to do that. Okay. I get how this works now.
Is there an idea that always seems to work when exciting or inspiring a team?
An idea that always seems to work? No, I think the answer to that might be no. There is custom, there are custom elements to this. So, you've heard of one-to-one marketing maybe. At IDEO, I really think we have one-to-one HR. Right? If you're doing this stuff right with really creative people, it's like Francis Ford Coppola said, you got to invite them to the party. With really creative people, you got to know what makes them tick. Right? We have actually had, in the history of IDEO, we've had 2 different docs on staff. And both of the docs at some point said, I don't just want to work on these medical projects, right? It goes against your intuition, but you got to understand what their needs are. And if they've just done 2, super complex 2-year-long projects, they want to work on a toy next. And if you know that, if you understand them that much better, it equips you as a leader to give them what they want and need next. So, there's a lot of suggestions in my book. That silver bullet one that you're looking for, not sure I have that one. But keep in mind this idea about inviting them to the party. I have used that in principle a lot of times.
What would you say is one of the best examples of a groundbreaking change of a business culture and maybe strategic thinking?
So, change of a business culture, I have personally witnessed 2 of them really up close. I've mentioned Procter & Gamble maybe too many times, so it is a hometown favorite, or it's at least quasi-local here. But I'll mention the other one that I got to witness close up, which was that Samsung one that I mentioned in the very first chart I showed. This was the stodgiest, most autocratic organization I ever saw. Right? The idea that emerged through our work is this one of reverse mentoring, of let's listen at least a little bit to what the kids have to say, right? I swear that had never occurred to them before, right? And so it opens you up. Now, just to show that I have some balance for the people my age in the room, I just want to point out those kids, and we hire student interns as young as 17 sometimes. They haven't achieved wisdom yet. Some of them haven't achieved judgment of the type we are looking for. So I'm not saying they have all the answers, but the raw ideas they are amazing at. And so Samsung just opened up and said, we're not as good as these other players, and we want to be. And little by little by little, through a process of humility and learning all the time, like what are we going to learn today? What are we going to try today? Wow, they are a world-class player, as indicated by that chart and and other indications might have. I'll just give you one Procter & Gamble example because it's closer to home. I I'm sitting around one day, post-change, where Procter & Gamble has become much more innovative. This is during the Lafley administration, and AG has just left the organization. But I'm sitting with a guy, and he's a few years older than me. He's got a few pounds overweight. He's just kind of everyman. He's just a kind of a regular old guy. But I'm talking to him, and we're talking to lunch, talking about sports and miscellaneous stuff. And at one point I said to him, hey, you're kind of a design and innovation guy. I bet this is a good time to be at Procter & Gamble. And this guy who's been kind of laid back, soft-spoken the whole meal, he leans forward to me, and he gets this fire in his eye, and he says, Tom, guys like me have been waiting our whole lives for a moment like this. And I'm thinking, that's what I want. Bottle that up, right? You can get this, this regular old guy to show up at work in Cincinnati, Ohio with that kind of fire in his eye. Wow, that's magical. That is a competitive advantage for that organization that they created through leadership and through innovation. And so, the Procter & Gamble example, I really enjoyed watching that transformation. One more, or okay, just keep going. All right.
What's an optimum environment for innovation, and how do you create it?
Well, as far as the physical environment, I've written 2 chapters of 2 books about that, and so the question is hard to come up with a short answer. But let me just put it this way. There's one of the best books on innovation in workspace itself. It's written by this guy named Franklin Becker. Becker and Steele, they wrote a book called Workplace by Design. And one of Frank Becker's things that's really stuck with me is this idea that he says that all the marketing materials and all the emails from upper management, he says that's the verbal language of the organization. Right? But he says your physical work environment, that's the body language. Right? And as humans, we've taught basically from birth that when the verbal language and the body language disagree, it's the body language that's speaking the truth. And one of his metaphors, he said, if you have an R&D center, a research and design center that's laid out in very rigid ways and has these delicate, easy-to-scratch surfaces in it, he says, that's like a lover saying, I love you, in a bored voice while doing a crossword puzzle. Right? The words themselves are actually pretty good. The verbal language is good. The body language is off. Right? And we trust the body language. And so, I encourage when we're working with client teams to look at your space and say, does it tend to support or does it tend to contradict the kind of behavior that you're trying to get from your team? And often, it does, in fact, contradict. But space is very powerful. I'll give you a personal example. I won't bring in the Cleveland Clinic because it might get too close to home, but I'll give you a personal example, which is Berkeley. I have a small position at the business school at Berkeley. And when I went there, it was this crumbling old building that we shared with the social sciences, and it was ugly, and it was awful, and it was, soul stealing. I mean, it was just an awful space. The building was literally crumbling. I studied in the library, and piles of stuff, plaster or something, would pile up every day, and they'd sweep it away at night, and they'd be there again in the morning. I don't think it was rat poison. I think it was the stuff. Anyhow, and so that was okay. That was just the way things were. I didn't think about it too much. But shortly after I left, thanks to the Haas family, the founders of Levi Strauss, they built this super gorgeous new facility, right, with lots of airy and beautiful spaces and great rooms for team meetings and stuff like that. And I am certain that it is a better school. They attract better professors and better students because the space is conducive to great performance, right? And so, wow, space can be expensive, but cheap at twice the price if you think about its influence on the team that works in that space. In my book, by the way, I talk about Jacobs Field and the Cleveland Indians, but I won't try to tell that story here. They didn't stay so good. They were really great right after that field was built, if you remember, 1994. But there you have it. Okay, one more, and it's over there.
Okay, are these skill sets inherent or are they learned?
Oh, actually, this is a great question. I'm so happy that you asked that because this is actually the subject of my next book, which I'm attempting to write with my brother David. Are they inherent or learned? And you can completely learn this, right? Now, you can't, take Thomas Edison. Could you learn to be a better inventor than Thomas Edison was? Only if you're born as Thomas Edison, probably. But it is my fundamental belief that everyone can significantly raise their game in this department, right? And as just an example of that, I will mention myself, right? My brother was always the creative, crazy kid taking apart the piano, like playing in a rock band, all that kind of stuff. And I was the straight arrow. In fact, right before joining IDEO, I worked for a consulting firm where all the work involved spreadsheets, and all the bosses had gone to West Point, like literally. And so we were linear thinkers, we were left-brain thinkers, whatever. And if you associate me with any of that innovation stuff I talked about, it's because I learned it by osmosis and also by good leadership at IDEO. Right? And so, wow, you can definitely learn this. And people have different native abilities and others. My daughter's a ballerina. And, it helps to be born with the right genes to be a ballerina, but everybody can dance, right? And so this is the really great news. I wrote about this in O magazine, in Oprah's magazine, about wherever you are here, it is possible to get unstuck. It is possible to sharpen your skills at innovation just like you sharpen your skills at other things around. So yes, you can totally do it. So, and I think now we're out of time. So thank you very much. Okay,
Tom, on behalf of all of us, I want to thank you for helping us sharpen our innovative skills. It clearly is near and dear to all of our hearts. You've been a great model for me and for this organization. You've helped us enormously. You've inspired us, you've challenged us, and I want to thank you. And I want to thank all of you for coming. And by the way, Tom has lined up outside, and he will have applications to work at IDEO if any of you want to do it. Thank you, Tom.